He asked me if I was sitting down, and I was like, yeah. And then he, sounded odd, and then he told me that my mom and brother had been shot.
And what'd you do?
Well, Brooklyn, my girlfriend, was with me, and I think she heard she could hear my conversation kind of over the phone, and so she just started packing stuff. And
hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. I've always found it strange that when Buster was asked, what did you do? What was your reaction when he found out what had happened to his mother and brother? He immediately talks about his girlfriend.
I kind of just sat there for a minute. I was in shock, but eventually we got our stuff together and drove down to Moselle.
Now, of course, the other thing that was raised very cleverly at trial was this whole idea that if there's a killer out there, if there are these vigilantes out there, why on earth would you summon your son to Moselle? Why on earth would you summon your brothers, right? If your family is in danger, if you are in danger, would you really want to endanger anyone else? So that really spoke volumes. Now, in this episode, we're going to deal with the sins of the fathers plural. And in theory, Buster plays a really important role as the first in line to the Murdaugh throne. After Maggie and Paul are no longer there, Buster plays a very important role as kind of the next in line in terms of this whole Murdaugh dynasty. And if Alex is caught, just think about that theory, that sort of scenario. If Alex commits a crime and he's caught, if he's caught for committing a crime, then Buster inherits Maggie's estate, right? And if Buster is his father's son, and if Buster remains within his father's sway, within his father's approval, and his testimony in support of his father seems to suggest that, well, then indirectly, Alex gets what he wanted anyway, doesn't he? He gets control, access to Maggie's estate. And in the previous video, we spoke to some extent about Maggie's millions, and I want to continue that conversation and exactly how they ended up under Alex's control, or at the very least under the control of the Murdaughs, right? But there are some interesting legal mechanisms in probate law, which is law that deals with wills and testaments and so on. And we have already covered some quirky issues related to Maggie's will, but instead of dealing with June 7th and June 10th and the financial aftermath, and we are going to do that, but instead of doing that right now, we're going to deal with Randolph and his role in the Murdaugh mythos. And but before we do that, I want to go to midnight on July 24th, 1940, almost 80 years ago, to the train wreck that started it all. Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. By the way, I saw a statistic that something like 69% of people viewing my video aren't subscribed. And so if you're someone who regularly comes to the channel, maybe you want to subscribe. I would really appreciate it if you do. If you're enjoying this video, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button. I also want to alert you to the fact, something I'm really looking forward to, something I'm really excited about. I'm doing another interview, I think the second, with California-based writer and author Kathleen Hale. She wrote an article recently, not her first, I think her second or third, in Vanity Fair, dealing with the issues going on around Idaho, and she actually went to Idaho herself. So I'll be dealing with, we'll be doing a live discussion at 8 p.m. Pacific, 11 p.m. Eastern, so try and make that. In terms of this episode, let's get started. So I'm going to take you back to July 24th, 1940, more than 80 years ago, right? And we get a lot of this information via Greenville Online. I'll put a link to that in the description. A really good article. And it actually takes us slightly further back than that. The year before the death of Randolph Murdaugh, the whole patriarch to this whole dynasty, right? And you're going to really be shocked at the parallels, how history seems to repeat itself in this family. You may need to kick yourself and remind yourself that we're dealing with 1939 and not 2021, because you had a situation where an old man was suffering from health problems. He had been for about a year, since 1939. And the local paper, The Guardian, reported on a couple of occasions that he had just been released from hospital, right, in April, right? And then a couple of months later, they sort of wondered whether his health was a factor in this accident, right? And then there was also questions about, was it an accident? So according to Greenville Online, quote, locals and historians have also wondered and speculated without direct evidence if alcohol was involved in this crash. Now it's like, wow, what are we talking about? Are we talking about the boat incident? No, we're talking about a train incident, someone who was driving. And historical records, according to Greenville Online, and newspaper accounts gave no firm clue if that was the case. And so you kind of got to wonder, well, if alcohol wasn't obviously the case in the patriarch's death, then what are we talking about? Did he make a mistake driving? Did he kind of tune out for a moment? And then there is actually a hint that he took his own life deliberately, right? And the article says there's no probable cause to that supposition, but it is nevertheless part of the mythos of his death that is a possibility. And then you have that idea, right, that something is made to look a certain way, and then it looks like an accident, and then someone is liable for that. And then you have the same thing seemingly repeating itself later on in the family history with Alex Murdaugh, where there's this appearance that he's also wanting to take his own life. But appearances, as we see with this family, can be deceiving. Now, going back to the article, it says, quote, the Hampton County coroner's jury simply ruled the death an accident. The public would likely never know the exact contributing cause of this collision. So it was a collision between a train and Randolph Murdaugh's vehicle. And we're going to deal with the exact circumstances in a moment. But the aftermath of this incident that cost him his life was that the Murdaugh family suspected that that there was foul play from the train's perspective. In other words, that the train was at fault, right? And if you think about it in a very basic way, you are driving, you end up on the train tracks, you can go anywhere. You can go forwards, backwards, left, right, fast, slow. Anyway, the train can only go on the track that it's on, and it can only slow down, and it doesn't know that you're going to stop on the track. And so then you say, no, the train is to blame because I stopped my car on the tracks when the train went over. And then you say, how on earth do you figure that? But that is exactly what happened here. So according to the article, quote, within a week of the fatal 1940 train crash, the 14th Circuit had a new solicitor, Randolph Buster Murdaugh Jr. So you kind of have the situation where his father, right, Randolph Murdaugh, dies in this train crash. And then what happens? His son basically takes over the case and sues the train company, and that really sets up the family legacy going forward. And as we know, this individual was not very well to begin with. And so the article refers to Randolph Buster Murdaugh, that's Randolph Jr., taking legal revenge for his father's death. And this Randolph Murdaugh would then become the father to Randolph Murdaugh III, which was Alex Murdaugh's father, right? So there are actually three Randolphs. There's Randolph Murdaugh Sr. He was the solicitor from 1920 to 1940. He's the one that died because of the train. Then there's Buster Murdaugh, his son, right? And so Buster Murdaugh is Buster's great-grandfather. Not his grandfather, his great-grandfather. His grandfather is Randolph Murdaugh, and he died in 2021, just after the deaths of Maggie and Paul. And there is definitely something very Star Warsy about the Murdaugh family. It's kind of like Luke Skywalker finally being confronted with this reality, finally realizing that his father is on the dark side. And one wonders whether Buster has realized that or whether he's in denial.
Never join you! If you only knew the power of the dark side.
And so possibly the dark side, that the story of this dark side goes all the way back to 1940. And whether or not it was a manipulative stunt, whether or not it was some kind of scheme for the family to profit, from this supposed accident, it nevertheless set the stage for one Murdaugh profiting off the loss of another. And that's a family member, right? And so is that not what happened in 2021? Because within a week of the fatal 1940 train crash, according to the Greenville Online, the 14th Circuit had a new solicitor, right, very, very quickly. And didn't the senior Randolph Murdaugh know that if he died, well, the next person in line would be Buster, and he would benefit if he could prove something, something about the train. And that is really how the Murdaugh family legacy really got its boost, got its start, began with a fortune, series of fortunate events, I guess. And so the article talks about him taking legal revenge. Kind of got an ominous ring to it, doesn't it? Now, going back to the article, quote, prior to his death, Randolph Sr. had taken on the rail company a time or two, records tell us. So you kind of get this idea that Randolph had tried to score a couple of points against this rail company and then failed. And one wonders whether he tried to get the last laugh, right? And did he? Didn't he? Anyway, the article goes on to say history does not suggest that was a major focus of his practice, but he certainly did have run-ins with that railroad company. And so that is something one would want to dig into. What actually happened there? Did he take him on and win? Did he feel shortchanged? What really happened? Did he spot an opportunity? Was it one of the biggest businesses in town? And so this idea of this rail company not being a major focus, well, that changed when the Murdaugh law firm, which was sort of in its infancy at that point, went after it. And this is where things get really interesting. Going back to the article, according to Hampton County Court of Common Pleas records, on October 1st, 1940, Randolph Jr., as executor of his father's will and estate, filed a summons and a complaint against the Charleston and Western Carolina Railway Company. According to the article, the lawsuit brought action on behalf of Randolph's widow, Mary Murdaugh, and her children for the wrongful death of said Randolph Murdaugh Sr. The article goes on to note that the suit alleged that the train was traveling from Yamasee to Varnville at a high rate of speed and failed to blow a whistle or ring a bell at the Camp Branch crossing. Now, if you were going to sue a railroad company for crashing into a vehicle that shouldn't have been there, you don't really have too many legs to stand on. Pretty much the only leg you've got to stand on is that the train was traveling faster than the train speed limit. But you've got to ask yourself, how fast could trains really travel in 1940. Anyway, the other thing was that they said that it failed to blow a whistle or ring a bell. But you could also imagine if the vehicle was idling near the railway line and at the last minute went onto the railway line, then it wouldn't know to blow a whistle or ring a bell because it would be unexpected. So the lawsuit also alleged that the crossing and its approach was in a rough and washed out and dangerous condition. I suppose that's a better argument, but then you've also got to ask, well, did anyone else have run-ins with the train, right? And isn't it the vehicle's fault if it can't get over, a road? Anyway, the article goes on to state that, quote, Murdaugh's view was obscured by trees and tall underbrush on that foggy night, placing him in sudden and imminent peril. Anyway, the bottom line was, accusing the train of traveling too fast and not blowing a warning whistle and rough conditions around the tracks. Buster Murdaugh demanded a judgment of $100,000, all right, for the death of his father. That was quite a lot of money in 1940. And so court records show that on the 22nd of September 1941, a little bit more than a year later, the case was settled and the amount that was paid over not disclosed. But something tells me that this was an early victory for the Murdaugh family and the Murdaugh law firm. And so this shows you how their influence kind of got a boost at this point. The article goes on to note that during the early 1900s, Randolph Sr. was in the right place and time to come to the aid of little Ed Ginn after the tragic train accident. And so what I think that's referring to is another client that they basically won a lawsuit against this railway company. And it kind of makes you think, in 1940, what is one of the biggest companies to use as an ATM, right? And then the article concludes saying, for more than 100 years, the Murdaughs ran their private law practice and the 14th Circuit, mixing civil law with criminal law, which is not uncommon at the time. And now that is a very strange and interesting confluence of events, mixing civil law with criminal law. You might say, what's wrong with that? Well, the Murdaugh case, the trial that we heard in court was exactly that, mixing civil law with criminal law, mixing fraud with what eventually ended up being a double homicide. And so you might ask the question, why should a law practice or a lawyer not be allowed to mix civil law with criminal law? Well, exactly because you might have conflicts of interest. And conflicts of interest come up again and again and again in terms of the narrative surrounding certainly Alex Murdaugh. And so ultimately it was this process of standing up for the little guy, right? But this all went all the way back to Randolph Murdaugh, the senior, the first one. He was kind of the first little guy who really sort of won big against these companies. And then ultimately the law firm that came about was called, well, the initials for it were PMPED. And I can't help thinking when I see those letters, PMPED, thinking of the word pimp or pimped. And, if you pimp someone's ride, you make something more showy or impressive. And if you think about how Alex Murdaugh conducted himself, he made a big show that he was going to, for example, to the housekeeper, that he was going to win a big settlement. And what ultimately happened. So Alex Murdaugh is very showy and very impressive, and he seems very emotional. Meanwhile, something else is going on. But being a pimp can also mean getting customers, to provide someone to a customer. And if you think about how the legal process was all about getting customers via these accidents and things taking place.
You killed him. No, I am your father.
That's impossible!
So right now, Buster is probably searching his feelings, trying to decide who his father really is. And I wouldn't be surprised if all the thoughts and all the feelings are sort of wrapped up in the appeal. There's going to be an appeal, and maybe, this idea that the jury got everything wrong, and they're going to sort of undo everything. The Murdaughs weren't born yesterday. They know their way around the block, the legal block, and they will be able to, fix this situation. Well, what do you think? Will they? And if they do or if they don't, where does that leave Buster? And so we're going to pick up the narrative where Randolph III dies, and then what actually happens in terms of the financial situation. And what is Buster's role in that is quite surprising. So I'm not going to take it further than that. Again, just a reminder, don't miss the live tonight. We will be talking to Kathleen Hale. If you've got any questions, make sure that you join us, and you can join the chat and ask your questions. She went to Idaho and had some really interesting experiences, met some familiar faces and also unfamiliar faces, and she's going to be taking us through that journey. So thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.